So the question was why I came to US from Beirut, Lebanon. That's the question. After I finished medical school, I was looking for more experience and training in the residency. And I was looking for family medicine training. And my mentor in medical school went to Baylor in Houston for his family medicine training. And I liked his approach to family medicine as a system looking at social problems rather than just as a isolated disease or case studies, and looking at people in their context, in their families, in society, as part of finding solutions for their problems. And I like that approach. And I was attracted to Baylor. Yeah, and when I came to the interview, I was biking at the time because I was scared of driving. I had a previous experience with a bad accident when I was a teenager. And while I was biking in Houston for the first week I was there, I was hit with a drive-by hit and run on the sidewalk, and I fractured my elbow. So during the interview, I had a lot of sympathy from everybody that interviewed me. And there was no emails back then, and I didn't have an actual appointment for the interview, and I was not really invited for the interview. So I used the fact that I had this injury and that my mentor was a previous student of Baylor, and I asked him, like, during the appointment to send a telex about his experience with me, that I would be a good asset to the program. And while I was being interviewed, they were telling me that they're really sorry, there is no place for me, and they have a lot of good candidates. But when the telex came, the chairman at the time, who was a classmate of my mentor, her whole demeanor changed, and she lit up and she said, "Okay, Ghanem, we're going to give you a chance, and we're going to consider you for the position to start residency at Baylor." And I left there, I was so excited, and I continued my interviews. I took the Greyhound bus through USA. It was like really cheap at the time, $100, $150, you could travel through unlimited. And I would stay with friends or people I would meet on the way while I'm interviewing. It was quite an interesting experience. And then Baylor was my first choice. And they really were focused on systems, in understanding systems in medicine, like looking at the system of disease in a context of family, society, and looking at the psychology background. And I started being very interested back then in the 80s with the not the opiate epidemic back then, but with the HIV epidemic. And I would take a video with me and visit patients at home who were having HIV, terminal disease, would videotape their how they're dealing with the disease in their context, in their home. And I would share it with my classmates in residency. And it was shocking for a few. They didn't want to see it, they didn't want to face it, because it was really looking at patients outside the hospital. And we were really trying to treat so many people at Jefferson Davis Hospital back then. It was floor after floor full of patients dying with very little hope of cure back then in the 80s. So getting to see them when they go home and they decide that they want to get treated at home, and end of life stories, and they share these stories with you, was very touching and very important to share that human experience at the time. And we had great experience with Bantab Hospital, where you had lots of exposure to very complicated emergency services and patients having very complicated problems on the floor. We would have 36-hour shift on the floor where you deal with very complicated patients. And you had to do everything for the patient. So if you wrote an order on the chart, start IV, you would go back to sleep, you wake up a couple of hours later because barely you get 2 hours, and the nurse would be sitting like this. You wrote order, start IV, Ghanem, we're waiting for you, you're going to start the IV or what? So you had to start the IV. If you wrote an order for a catheter, Foley catheter, because patient couldn't pee, you're the one to put the Foley. If you wrote an order for an X-ray, you're the one to transport the patient to go to X-ray. So you had to do everything from the janitorial work, nursing work, and that built some resilience dealing with complicated patients without really saying, I can't do it. It was, I can do attitude for everything. So it was a great experience, but even though I finished the residency, I felt that something is missing. And I like taking care of the entire spectrum of patients, and then I interviewed in Tacoma, Washington for fellowship in rural family medicine because I liked working in small communities, and the emphasis there was on complex obstetric patients. So that gave me a great head start dealing with a special group of patients that really needed the service that very few were paying attention to, and this was high-risk obstetrics. Our mentors were top specialists in high-risk obstetric in Tacoma, Washington. So when I came back to Texas, I was dealing with another crisis back then, which was the teenage pregnancy. And more than 50% of the patients I delivered, all the way from the 80s through 98, were teenage pregnancies. And I was very involved in increasing the awareness for teenagers about how pregnancy can change their life, and how to work more on involving the family and the context of the family in that complicated issue, rather than judging the teenagers or trying to police them. I was trying to understand them more. And I worked with multiple clinics in the area here when I moved to the Woodland, and in the residency program in Conroe, to increase the awareness and increase the skills both of nurse practitioners and residents, and in community clinics about high-risk pregnancies, especially as it relates to teenage. There is something else I was going to say about teenage pregnancy that's important. 70% plus of teenagers who engage in sex, no matter what contraception they use, end up being pregnant within 6 months. So that's how much it's impactful on communities across the board. I also got interested in why we have so much hospital intervention in pregnancy. Because when you're pregnant, you're a teenager, you're not as educated maybe, or not yet as educated in terms of your rights or in terms of your options. A lot of things happen that you may not be aware of. And so I got involved in what are other alternatives to hospital delivery, like home delivery for patients, or birthing centers, or alternatives to these high impact interventions where 25% of deliveries and more across the country are cesarean sections, where you get surgery if you're pregnant. So I started looking at all these options, and I got very interested in these alternatives, including water birth. And I found with every birth where I was involved in, involving the family at the time of birth, bringing the dad, the grandma, the family together at the time of delivery and being involved. And I would be the backup person rather than the main active person in the delivery. because this is what a birth is about. It's about family coming together. And this was the main area I was excited about, all the way till '98. So as a family doctor, what's exciting is over time, your practice changed, but your attitude, your approach, your interest in the patient remains grounded in your interest in the community and building relationships and engaging with those you care for. And that's what I like about family medicine, and I will always approach it this way. I think that's enough for now.